Hello and welcome back. If you haven't already, remember to subscribe. Today, we're going into one of the most vaunted and misused eras in American history, the Civil Rights Movement. Let's get straight into it. Now, this should be obvious, but paradoxically, it seems it isn't to a lot of people. The Civil Rights Movement was necessary. So, we're going to do a little thought experiment. I want you to picture a scenario, particularly if you're a Christian conservative. The dominant religious group in society are Satanists. Everywhere you go, they have the financial, social, and political power. Many popular politicians are also in an open, but don't talk about it way, group that involves donning satanic masks at night and violently attacking and intimidating Christians, who refuse to accept the dominant order. All schools and public spaces are separated. Christians have to go to schools that are less well funded, usually in poor and unsafe areas. Christians are restricted in what houses they can buy, even what public fountains they can drink from. Legislation states they are lesser and need protecting from the harsh world. At every point, attempts to change this through the ballot box are met with intimidation and voter suppression, from attacking people to prevent them from voting and using dirty tricks to stop Christians from voting in enough numbers to change the situation. Can you honestly justify such a regime? It seems horrifically dystopian, doesn't it? Yet, that was the lived, actual reality of the United States for people of colour in the first half of the 1900s and necessitated the Civil Rights Act. This is what Malcolm X and Martin Luther King railed against, and it's what so many gave their lives for. This is what the situation was in the world's hegemon for people of colour, and this is what people today try to justify as states' rights. The legacy of that period lives on today. Wealth is often generational. People accumulate over their lives and pass it on to their children, often investing that wealth in their children to gain better opportunities for them. I don't think anyone is going to argue that. It's pretty simple. Now, what happens when one segment of the populace is given access to opportunities, others are not? This is also simple. That populace gets ahead. So when you understand those two principles, is it really hard to understand that people of colour often have to work twice, even 3 times as hard as white Americans to make it, while still having to deal with individual racism and systemic racism? It feels like a massive kick in the teeth, but really it isn't. Nobody is taking away from your hard work, but they are recognising that it's a lot harder for people who don't have those advantages to get where you are. I'm a man. I am well aware that whilst I have been relatively successful in my field, it is a lot harder for a woman or a trans person to get the level of success that I have enjoyed. This is not a failure on my part, it's just simple fact. I often hear the refrain that life isn't fair, and that might be true, but is it fair to perpetuate a system of privilege and disadvantage when we profess to live in a fair and meritocratic society? I think not. I've often heard this problem put as thus. Imagine a classroom. A semicircle is formed and students are asked to throw paper balls into a bin. The best shots are going to land into the bin regardless of where they're seated, so moving people forward is simply unfair and not necessary. It harms people who are talented. Now, that makes no logical sense at all. It makes about as much sense as invading Russia in the winter. It's better to frame the argument as thus. Now imagine you've got 30 students in a classroom. 5 students have access to state-of-the-art laptops, the newest textbooks, private tuition, and one-on-one time with the teacher at regular intervals. 15 students have access to good laptops, relatively recent textbooks, and occasional access to the teacher. The last 10 students don't have laptops, have out-of-date textbooks, and are never given access to the teacher. Which students do you think are going to succeed? That's pretty obvious, isn't it? Which students are going to have to work the hardest to succeed, irrespective of talent? You see the problem. That last 10 students, as a direct consequence of the past 2 centuries in the United States, are overwhelmingly black and other persons of colour. It doesn't mean that there are no talented black people, or that they need help, but what it does mean is that people in such a background who have been denied the privileges that comes with generational wealth need to be accounted for, and those historic wrongs do need to be righted. After all, we all want to live in a just and fair society where everyone feels invested in our community, don't we? Now, a lot of conservatives like to say, the The civil rights movement won. There's no need for it anymore. But that again is patently untrue. You need only look at voter suppression and gerrymandering to see why this is still an issue today. A good example of this is when the state of Georgia mandated voter ID. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Until you realise they closed almost all of the places you could get accepted ID in almost all the black neighbourhoods in Georgia. This is not new, nor is it in any way out of the norm. Conservatives over the past 3 decades have been drumming up this idea of voter fraud as a way to pinpoint and exclude as many people as possible to prevent them from voting for their opponents. This logically, inevitably concluded with Donald Trump baselessly claiming the election was stolen from him. It's why a new Voting Rights Act is necessary today, and all the while, Fox News, OAN, and a whole host of radio hosts and Ben Shapiro's push the line that voter fraud is everywhere, like the commie hiding in your kitchen closet. An electoral system that deliberately, methodically moves to disenfranchise voters for no reason other than their potential political allegiance is a voting system that is going to destroy the integrity of the country. But for so long now, for the Republicans, it has been less about America and more about the continued accrual of power for the Republican Party. And I do not say that lightly. This extends across all sectors and segments in society, including the prison population. Conservatives love to pull out the stat that black people commit more crime and so are responsible for more of a prison population. Now this is true, POCs are overrepresented in criminal stats, but the analysis can and shouldn't end there. You have to ask why. Is there a reason? What is that reason? It is not good enough to say that it's because they're black, the same way it's not good enough to say it's because they're white when talking about school shooters. As a political scientist who is close friends with a number of sociologists, it just sits wrong to not ask why. Conservatives often misunderstand and deliberately misrepresent this drive to understand the causes of crime as excusing crime. Understanding is not the same as condoning. A good example of this is the Holocaust. We understand how it happened. We understand how people were driven to such horrific acts, but that does not mean we condone it. It is the same with crime. Until we understand why crime happens, we cannot effectively stop it. So why is the prison population amongst POCs so high? Well, there are several reasons. If two people, both alike, in almost every single way, with the same criminal history, it stands to reason that a fair and equitable justice system would give them the same sentence, doesn't it? Well, that isn't what happens. It's been documented several times over that POCs who are on the same crime with the same record as a white person in the exact same circumstances will receive a harsher sentence, which is one plank of just how such a massive weight of the prison population is black and other POCs. The second big plank is this. Look at the neighbourhoods that many POCs grow up in. They are often unsafe, policing is heavy, and educational funding practically non-existent. The resources for individuals to lift themselves up and out are scarce. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it does make it a lot harder. Think of that example in the classroom again. The 3 most common routes out and into some modicum of wealth are either sports, music, or crime. If your option as a young teen is a get-rich-quick life of dealing weed or pot on the side, as opposed to a horrible 9-hour grocery shift for a pittance, which is that kid going to choose? Wages are too low, the communities are too depressed, and the lack of any care from society has created a situation where crime seems like the only attractive way out for young people. That predominantly affects the poorer areas of society, who nearly all happen to be historic black neighbourhoods because of what happened in the past. A black neighbourhood that got too prosperous got burned down. Just ask Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a neighbourhood of wealthy black families was destroyed in the first aerial assault on US soil for daring to be rich whilst black. And bear this in mind, as discriminatory legislation has been pushed back and minorities have had increasing access to the same level of funding and education, we are seeing more and more diversity. The top tiers of society are no longer all white, just mostly white. But those on the right have an answer to this. They cry foul that this has come from a deliberate policy to disenfranchise whites. They have stirred anger and hatred over decades, giving falsehoods that sound logical. It's globalism that's the problem, not capitalism. It's regulations that are the problem, not a lack of regulations. It's socialism that's the problem, not a lack of it. It's forced integration, not racism. Over and over, this anger is stoked, and when it spills out, you get the scenes from the US Capitol in January. You get half the electorate, 70 million people, believing their election was stolen. This is a dangerous place to be in. This rage, this seething anger, this hatred and this fear is how the United States ended up with Donald Trump. It is the food of demagogues, the manna of populists, and the building block of a tyrannical and oppressive state. The way out of this is education, open dialogue and discussion, not provocation or the weaponizing of free speech, nor even the denial of basic human rights, but consideration. It's high time that conservatives started to look outside their own perspective, to, as Aristotle would say, lift ourselves up from our frog pond and explore. So talk to a socialist, talk to a liberal, talk to minorities, learn and listen, and maybe you'll find that people aren't so different, and that people on the left, minorities and others aren't the devils you thought, but just ordinary people who want to live a good, happy, prosperous and free life. Thank you for listening. Remember to share and subscribe, and feel free to comment and let me know your thoughts. Thank you and goodbye.